and this week I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Sigrid Lipka. Sigrid is a university reader in psychology at the University of Derby, and we're in the College of Life and Natural Sciences, so we share the same college structure. In fact, Sigrid is in the same office as me, so we know each other quite well. So what we're going to do this week then is just drill down into some of the material we've been covering in Unit 3. I will be referring to my notes in part here and trying to stick quite closely to the structure of the unit as it's laid down. So the first part then will be me just going through briefly the module contents, the unit contents, highlighting some of the main points there, and then we'll naturally get into a discussion about some of the key points, I think. Feel free to interrupt at any time.
I will do, Simon.
But before we do that then, I just want to remind you then, of course, that we have our Twitter feed, our hashtag #AAAMOOC. Please feel free to contribute to that and keep the conversation going there. And if you want to join me as a contact, that's me, Milton Broom. Don't ask about the name again. Right? So hashtag #AAAMOOC. Try and come on to the Twitter feed. It's very lively at the moment, and I'm inclined to answer direct questions and retweet and friend and all of that stuff. So get stuck into that. So let's just look at then the module contents this week. We had quite a packed module. I tried to squeeze in quite a bit into this module because it's all really, really important. We started out with the purpose of classification, a hot topic. This notion of classifying people into these discrete categories that are basically pathology units, so ADHD or autism and so on and so forth. And really to get you to understand the purpose of assessment in the context of classification of psychiatric disorders, which include developmental disabilities or developmental disorders. And then some of the issues and points of importance around the assessments for these particular conditions, autism and ADHD. We then moved on to a really, really important point, the purpose of diagnosis, why we actually diagnose. So there's a long history of psychiatry, as you'll probably be aware of, which is mainly fed through psychiatry by the diagnostic manuals. It's the DSM-5, the current version of the North American APA diagnostic manual, and version 10 of the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, by the World Health Organization, which in some respects can be considered the European or alternative, if you like, to the DSM. But it's much, much bigger than the DSM, of course. It doesn't just deal with psychiatric diagnosis. And then we spoke about referral and diagnosis and beyond, really, and what that means for the person who's receiving the diagnosis and the family, and the more holistic concerns around the implications of receiving a diagnosis of autism or ADHD, or not these days Asperger's, if we're conforming to the DSM criteria, because as you know, it's been removed as a discrete category and included into autism. But of course, those people who have an existing diagnosis of Asperger's retain that. The system, as it were, isn't so structured as to, it isn't policed or policed, as it were. It's mainly maintained by the experience of psychiatrists and people that do the diagnosis. So there's a slow lead into that and a sort of a slow lead out of previous versions of the DSM and the ICD. Incidentally, the ICD will be catching up with the DSM in a number of years, probably the next few years, and we expect that to be broadly paralleling the DSM in terms of the diagnostic criteria. So things are constantly changing, and it should be, because the diagnostic manuals change with our further understanding of these conditions, and quite rightly so. So the key points then from the section, before we move on to looking at these in more detail then. From questioning autism and ADHD in the previous units, we moved on to looking at classification, assessment and diagnosis. And we made the point that diagnosis is largely made on a behavioural basis, taking into account a clinical case history as well. So for children, that would be talking to the parents, interviewing the parents and the school teachers, the people that know the child the best, and then observing them in the class setting, or sometimes at home, sometimes in an assessment centre, depending on the circumstances. So there is a significant variation in symptoms in the presentation of all of these diagnoses. Very definitely for autism. As we know, autism is a syndrome, a spectrum, and exists on a continuum of severity. So we've got the autistic continuum of degrees of severity of impairment. And it's really important to understand that although a person might receive a diagnosis of autism, or for that fact, any other developmental disability, childhood disability, they may bear no resemblance to somebody else with exactly the same diagnosis. So people with the same diagnosis can present in entirely different ways. They'll have some shared similarities surrounding the diagnostic criteria, but not necessarily looking like or presenting as each do. So there's a wide degree of heterogeneity or variance, however you want to refer to it. There are multiple referral routes. You can receive a referral for diagnosis, assessment, and then diagnosis from self-referral, parent referral, school referral, SENCO, which is a special educational needs coordinator, paediatrician, any professional really, often through the GP, or the CAMS service. That's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service in the UK. Other countries have got different setups, of course. At the moment, the wait for an assessment in the UK is absolutely horrendous. It can take years before you even get in front of someone to assess your child. So it's very frustrating so often for parents. There are certain ways you can shortcut the system, but not necessarily the most effective ways. So there can be a delay and a waiting list. And there's very much a lack of provision up and down countries. There's a bit of a postcode lottery. So that's some of the key points then from the section. I do have a number of questions for you, Sigrid, if that's all right. So I put together these questions based on what I know of your own interests, really. So the first thing I want to do is to really get a feel for your involvement in children's language and your background and experience, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little about that.
Right, yes, it's nice to be here. And so, well, I've been interested in language acquisition, I don't know, always. I've always been interested in it. Right. So as a student of psychology, I chose modules that had to do with language acquisition. I did lots of placements. So I worked in a clinic for adult aphasic patients. Then I did a placement in a residential school for children who suffered from severe stammering. And it was really, I really loved it. It was really interesting. And then later on, when I did postgraduate research, I did a master's in communication studies, and my master's project was on children who had a road traffic accident that led to brain injury. So they suffered from aphasia.
So that was like a knock to the head.
Yes,
traumatic brain injury.
Yes, exactly. Right. Later on in my own research and at PhD level, I sort of focused more on adults and normal performance reading. But I have a personal interest as well in children's language development and problems or disorders, because one of my nephews had a road traffic accident himself years ago. So a brain injury and so on. He had some aphasia, but also memory problems. But he's doing quite well now. But you know, it was interesting for me because what I was interested in at a sort of research level also suddenly caught up with my own life.
So it sort of brought it all to life, really.
Yes, very much so. Yes.
Right, wow.
So it was great, though. Or, you know, it was useful for me to have a bit of background in terms of research and placements. I think that did help me to sort of support him and my family, my sister, etc. as well.
So it's always good to have a sort of a personal interest, isn't it, in that? Because one thing as academics, well, certainly I have found, is I can get so wrapped up into things like research and especially PhDs.
Yes,
you can get lost.
Yes,
you can get lost in the theory of it all.
Yes, exactly.
And then when you do like voluntary work or have something like that, an experience like that, all of a sudden you fall back actually on your psychology and think, actually, I do know a bit about this.
Yes. And it's interesting because more recently there's been a real push, hasn't there, for impact of our research, and it's something that I strongly believe in as well. I think basic research is very important, and we must carry on doing research, gathering evidence, etc. But I think we also want to and need to see how this research can help society at large. So our research shouldn't just matter, you know, in the lab or, you know, in wherever we do the studies, but also for practice in the real world.
So that application of psychology is, you know, is something that not a lot of jobs actually get to do they? You know, you can take it from a theoretical point right through to hypothesis testing, data collection, confirmation of hypothesis, whatever, working out interventions or whatever it might be. So I think the unique thing about psychology is you can take it right the way from initial thought to practice.
Yes, that's the exciting thing. And
it is.
After all these years that I've been involved with psychology, that is still really what excites me the most.
Yeah, that's probably a good message to go out to people considering psychology as a career.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, well, thanks for that. My second thing I wanted to quiz you on then was what you thought about children's language further. So how do children's language abilities differ? So are children with developmental disabilities that different from one another?
Nice question, big question. First thing I would like to say is that all children are different. So even in typical, what we call typical language development, you see big differences, both between children. So say if you have several children yourself, or if you compare your child to your neighbor's child, you know, you might say, oh, little whatever, Peter, you know, started saying his first words. Last week my child is the same age, still not saying anything. You know, do I need to be worried or not? But also children differ on different days or different weeks, depending on their emotion, how they feel, other pressures. So there are differences both within and between individuals.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
In the normal range of development, or the typical range of development. And then your second question was, well, are children with developmental disabilities fundamentally different, or are they maybe part of that continuum that we see anyway? Exactly. And to be honest, I don't think anybody can give you a full answer. I think this is one of those questions that further research and practice and intervention needs to focus on. But certainly the medical model that you mentioned before would assumes that, right? Make that assumption that, a label, we can say this is a child with SLI, I'm interested in SLI, specific language impairment, or this is a child with pragmatic language disabilities. And this is fundamentally different from what we see in a more typical child. It's not just a bit worse, a bit more extreme. It's a fundamental difference. I don't know, and your students hopefully will know what the evidence is for that, but it's a big question, definitely.
It seems to me that we're forced into this route of categorizing rather than seeing disabilities or differences on a continuum. And it's somewhat being reclaimed by groups like parental advocacy groups who refuse to accept that, for example, autism is anything but a difference. So you have neurodiversity coming in. It's a difference rather than a sort of a quantitative difference, so a category that is distinct. So you can have these degrees of severity, and I think the DSM has shifted slightly in its thinking around this now. So psychiatry is more or less concerned with pathology and more concerned with typical development. And
can I just say a comment on this though? Because one thing I think I would say is that, and we can discuss this obviously, but I would say you probably need a diagnostic label to be able to plan support and intervention.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm not saying it should be a label that needs to stick with the child. It certainly needs lots of ongoing assessment rather than just assessing the child at one time point. Obviously people don't do that. They offer assessment of the child in different contexts, different situations, by different people, with different people in different situations, etc., and over time. So I think that is very important to have this kind of continuous, ongoing assessment of the child's performance, whatever it might be. So maybe more pragmatic or language abilities in case of suspected, say, autism. But then I think you do need to, maybe with a multidisciplinary team, need to make a decision. Well, what do we think is the main issue here, or are the main issues?
I see, yeah.
Otherwise, I would argue that it would be difficult to plan support and intervention. What do you think about that?
I think that's correct, and I think we can't escape the medical model that psychiatry has put forward. And in part, this is why I've been playing devil's advocate, is arguing for 2 points. And our learners will probably have looked at Sami Tamimi's video. Sami Tamimi is a psychiatrist who is very well respected but holds very strong views. He's probably best described as an anti-psychiatry psychiatrist. And he and many of his group feel that we shouldn't overly pathologize children, especially when we're dealing with something like ADHD. Which at the best of times is difficult to diagnose. Autism probably a little bit more clear cut at the more, although we don't use the word lower functioning end. So no, I agree, we do need categorical distinctions, and I think the diagnostic manuals are essential personally, but there is a view that actually we don't, especially where they lead to interventions that are medical in terms of in ADHD stimulant medications.
Yes.
So,
and I mean that's a good point, because interventions can obviously take many different shapes and forms. So medication, but I think a lot is to do with how you interact with the child, the context as well, the situation, how you structure it. So like any behavior, in a way, you need to understand what the triggers are of certain behaviors. Do a bit of like observation, maybe keep a diary or something of when a child shows symptoms to a greater extent. Remember those differences we talked about. A child isn't always the same. So in which situations or with which people is the child maybe more at ease or behaves in a more desirable way. So the interventions might focus very much on the sort of behavioural aspect of the issue, the problem.
I agree. I think paediatricians have got a hard time actually. Developmental psychologists as well, because often the gold standard is a longitudinal study. 3-5 years, something like that, so we can plot in individuals over time changes to get a real world feel rather than doing cross-sectional or something like that. And that's not how academia works. It
takes a lot of resources, a lot of commitments, and yes, study that say takes 3 years, 5 years. It's difficult, it's challenging, but it can be done, and it has been done. There are some published studies out there, obviously really long-term as well, or revisiting previous cohort that you studied maybe 10 years later even, and see, I mean, I think that's very interesting as well, to check or to understand better what the long-term consequences are of childhood developmental disabilities, be it language, communication, ADHD or whatever. So for example, the impact this had maybe on quality of life, academic performance, jobs, social and romantic relationships and things like that. So I think we do need longitudinal research.
I think we do. There's not so much of it these days, I feel. Have you heard of I think I've got it right, the Child's database, the Twin Studies database, which has been running for years and years. Yes. Really high quality.
Actually, it's nice that you mentioned that. I mean, there are various, you need collaboration. I think you can't do it on your own. And Child's is a very good resource that people can use, where researchers from different labs, different countries contribute and collect their data. It's free access, so people can analyze the data in whichever way they want. So you might have a comparison group you're interested in, but you can't recruit that, or would not be feasible to recruit it there and then, but you can check what other people have found for that particular group, age group, cultural group, in a different location. So that database allows for a lot of nice research, secondary research, really.
I think it's good to collaborate at that level. But you pick up on some interesting points there, because of the natural changes in children over time, with their physiological changes, their brain-based changes, hormones and adolescence, and the peaks and troughs and the sex differences and so on and so forth. Plotting things like autism or ADHD over time is incredibly difficult, because as you say, children differ within themselves and then across groups as well. So, and there's also the have you heard of this, there's different names for it, but the effect of the child being in the clinician's office?
Yes.
How they can be completely different
it is
than at home.
Yes, or at school. Like
or at school,
yeah. So context, that's what I mean by context. The environment makes a huge difference. knowing that you're being observed makes a difference. So you know, speaking to camera is different to speaking informally, sitting in a clinic or in a doctor's office. However, yeah, I think many doctors, obviously, or speech language therapists, etc., people who do the assessment, they're very aware of it, and obviously they will try and everything they can to make sure the child is at ease and performs as naturally as possible. But there is an observer effect, Heisenberg principle, I think is one name for it. I think there are other names for it. So you need to take this into account, and you can try, obviously, to, as a researcher, for example, you might, instead of inviting the children to your lab, you go out, you know, to the home and you record, audio, video record interactions between the child and parents.
Well, that's interesting. So it's more real-world validity, isn't it? So you're ensuring you're capturing them naturalistically, I suppose.
Yes, it would be more naturalistic. That's right.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, as a fellow psychologist, is what do you think of the DSM and the ICD?
It's interesting because it changes over time. So I know many people then say, well, why should we even look at this? Because, you know, every so often, every 5-10 years or whatever, there's a different edition. I think it's a useful framework. So it's not the truth.
No,
nothing is the truth.
No, that's right.
Things change based on our understanding, our research, and it does need to change. It can lead to some frustrations, both at the parents or the patients' from the patient's point of view. For clinicians, obviously, as well, you have to adjust and check, you know, the current versions of those manuals. I think they serve a purpose as a framework, but nothing much deeper than that. So for each individual case, you know, you need more than just the sort of very strict categories.
Yeah, I'd agree with you definitely on that. So what are your views on classification then, and the process of assessment and diagnosis? There's a very clear-cut process, isn't there, of the child is looked at based on these categories, these classifications, and if they fulfill the criteria, more often than not, they'll get a diagnosis.
Okay, so I'll stick my head out here and say I personally, I personally think that actually classification is useful because it helps you to compare an individual child with other children, and the child across time as well. So the child at time point A as compared to the same child 5 years later. So I think it's useful. Now you say what?
Well, I do and I don't. I think it's useful for some people. So I would agree with you in part. We can't escape it. No, it's not going to change. That, you know, in the next decade, we're going to be lumped with this. So we've used it. It's come out of psychiatry. Now we're seeing the huge impact of imaging, functional imaging, and that's informing diagnosis, and I think we'll do so, more so in the future. So we won't have to rely on so much behavioural cues like observation and clinical case history.
But I think these sources of evidence need to be combined. So classification is one thing. I think the real issue is, for me, what evidence do we use to classify a child?
Oh, okay, right,
Is it just the blood pressure we take? Obviously not, or, you know, an fMRI scan. No, the classification should use a range of evidence, or data, case history, individual deep, you know, analysis of the individual case, parents' views, teachers' views, other people's views as well. I mean, a child, you know, typically has, interacts with a range of people. So for, say, a clinician, speech and language therapist, or anybody like that, a practitioner, this makes the task harder because it's not as simple like, okay, a couple of tests with the child or put them into an fMRI machine. I have to collect evidence from a wide range of sources and combine it and make sense of it. So I think if we get the evidence right, then our labels, our diagnostic labels, will be more appropriate, and I think that must be for the good.
So it's more an art.
Yes.
A skill, isn't it? Really?
It's a skill, and needs practicing and continuous development on the side of on the part of the practitioners as well. But I think it can be done.
I think we're getting better at it, and the diagnostic criteria are being refined continually, but they're also being widened as well, so they're more inclusive, which at the peripheries you're likely to have people with misdiagnosis, I think, increasingly. Anyway, perhaps
Yes.
that's a bigger debate.
Yes, it's a big debate, definitely.
This moves us on to our next question then. How do you view language, comorbidity within autism and ADHD or other childhood disorders?
Well, language and communication, so both speaking, listening, talking, reading, writing, all that, body language, is obviously fundamental to any condition or any typical behavior as well. Specifically, say, the pragmatic use of language, i.e. how we use language in social situations, how we understand jokes, how we address different people in different ways, depending on how well we know them, the status, our status, their status. All those sorts of skills aren't taught formally to a child in a first language or main language acquisition, but they pick it up usually fairly quickly. And it's something that can break down as well. And people have argued whether those sort of pragmatic language skills form a category in their own right, or whether there's a continuum. I think pragmatic problems or issues with language may arise for quite a number of different reasons. And one reason might be there's a bigger problem with social interaction, pointing towards autistic type symptoms. Or, for example, if a child suffers, to go back to that initial example, from a strong stutter, or has SLI, so say with a specific problem in using grammar, syntax properly in understanding and talking, that will obviously affect the way they use language, because they might misunderstand what you say. And they come across as really bizarre in their utterance, so it's pragmatically odd, but it's not because they have a problem with social interaction. They had a problem with decoding what was said for a syntactic reason. So that's why I think having a clear label is actually useful, because, you know, obviously you would try different types of training programs and interventions with a child, say, who has a syntactic problem and therefore has a problem with pragmatics as well, as opposed to a child who's fine with syntax but has a pragmatic problem because of a social impairment. So
there are all kinds of interventions we can put in place, all those with all those elements of language as well, aren't there? So, and I think actually psychology is very good at doing just that. So it feeds into speech and language therapists.
Psycholinguistics in particular, so the combination of your linguistics training, psychological training. And then, you know, obviously, you need to know about the medical basis as well, I guess, and learning theory, social learning. Bandura recently got, I don't know, the biggest, I can't remember which award he was given recently, but, you know, you must look at his research about social learning, so the way, you know, development and interaction happens in a social context, and we do learn from each other all the time. That is the case, you know, in the developmental, typically developing children as well as the atypically developing children.
All of that classic psychology is fed into the point where we are now, and with the advent of all these new imaging technologies, I think it's a real rich time for psychology at the moment.
Absolutely, exciting time.
People like Steven Pinker, right at the forefront of psychology, commenting on lots of issues around this. Thanks for that. That's quite insightful. Let's move on then. Well, I wanted to ask then, do you have any advice or tips for parents who suspect their child has problems with language? So what advice or tips might you pass on?
One thing is, I guess I would say, don't panic. It sounds a bit patronizing, I don't mean it in that way, but bear in mind that children do differ, but be vigilant as well. So do keep an, look out for unusual behaviors. Talk to other parents, but or other people involved, the teachers, carers, nursery teachers, and so on, who see your child regularly as well, or your family, your sisters or grandparents who help look after the child. So you get a picture of whether what you observe, and that's something that might have worried you, you get a picture of whether this is really quite common for the child, or whether it's more like a one-off in certain situations. I would also say do get some advice as well, so try and go to your GP maybe in the first place, especially because you mentioned that any referral to a specialist assessment, like the SAT assessment by speech and language therapist, for example, or pediatrician, that can take quite a while. So, you know, I think it's important to rule out any, or rule in or out, diagnose what's going on if you're worried. So I would say if you're worried, do speak to your GP. There's a big debate about whether we should wait and see or whether we should intervene quickly. Most people would tend to say, well, yeah, bear in mind there's individual variation, yes, but don't wait and see. It's better to ask and check with the experts whether anything is the matter than wait for too long. There are critical windows for, or there's a critical window for language and communication development in particular. As most people realize, when you try and learn a second language later in life, and that could mean like at the age of 10, 12 onwards, you normally learn it in a different way, and very typically you don't ever learn it, acquire the language to quite the same level of expertise. There will always be an accent. Obviously a second language speaker, and I learned English not as a simultaneous bilingual, but later in life. Afterwards. So one thing you can't get rid of ever, I think, is your accent. Whereas little kids, if you put them into bilingual, multilingual environment from the start, they are perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a critical window for language acquisition. So if you miss that, say the child is 8, 9, 10 years of age, and there is really a problem with their language acquisition device or whatever it might be, the mental architecture that helps the child learn language, then it will be so much harder for an intervention to have an effect, because that critical window will have passed. So don't wait and see.
No, that's got to be sound advice, especially what you're saying about going to your GP as well, because they're able to rule out other things.
Yes.
You know, more obvious things that one might not have considered.
Good point. Yes.
So there's always, you know, for some things that look like ADHD, perhaps not autism, there are more common sense explanations.
Yes, and they need to be considered.
They do,
to be systematically checked out. You're absolutely right. Yes, I agree.
So GP often first port of call, and always a good source of advice. Well, not always, but often a good source of advice.
And you mentioned comorbidity several times, so the phenomenon that several things might be going on at the same time. Obviously, that's the case. So there might be other things that are going on as well. So the child might have, I don't know, I'd say a chronic or repeated middle ear infection, so their hearing might be affected on and off. They're not, or they, the GP or whoever will do the assessment would also check, I guess, the family situation. Are there any particular traumas or stresses in the child's life at the time? Social relations, is there any bullying at school, whatever it might be. So you do really need to look at the person as a whole, the child as a whole, not just focusing on one particular, maybe the most obvious symptom. The symptom might be obvious, but the particular causes or influencing factors might be quite diverse, in fact.
In the literature many years ago, there was a common source of misdiagnosis was between infants or neonates with autism and deaf kids. And what people didn't realize was that often children with autism won't turn and orient to their name or familiar voice like the mum as spontaneously as a child who doesn't later go on to receive a diagnosis of autism. So in those early days, there was a great misunderstanding of what the parts of autism were and how long you needed to leave it to get a reliable diagnosis. And so misdiagnosis is, I think there are safety parts of the assessment procedure in place to prevent stuff like that happening now.
Yes.
But superficially, it's quite tricky with the comorbidities. Not just deafness, but where you might have things like depression going alongside ADHD.
Yes, we haven't even talked about mental health issues in children, anxiety, depression, factors like that, emotional conditions, learning disabilities potentially as well. A range of things. So you're right, it does, to work out, where the child's at and what you can do, you need to also rule out certain things.
Yeah, and I think it says that in the DSM. It says not better explained or described by another clinical category.
So it's a bit relative, yes.
It is, isn't it?
And
Yeah.
sometimes several things might actually, however, happen at the same time. Or there's a lovely, big research initiative now recently, actually, about specific language impairment in bilingual children.
Okay.
And that's not, bilingualism isn't a condition, but it certainly can be a challenge or an additional challenge for a child learning a language, not least for the person assessing the child, because you need to know or assess the child in all the languages they speak, and you might not have the right test norms. They might not exist.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
So you need to get other people from the community in to help you assess the child's language in, say, Welsh, native Welsh and English, or any of the languages the child speaks.
That's fascinating. So it just that just helps us get a broader sense on this big issue of assessment, classification, and the process of diagnosis. I think we'll wrap it up, but before we do, I just wanted to ask you, now you are a program leader for a master's level course, aren't you? Would you?
Yes, here at Derby we've recently started an MSc, a master's program in what's called behavior change. Big topic these days. Behavior change is simply trying to use our knowledge from psychology and related areas such as ergonomics, for example, to understand people's behavior, including children and adolescents, understand their behavior, but also specifically understand how we can change our behavior.
Okay.
Remember New Year's resolutions about half a year ago? Do you remember what you people typically do? Like, I want to do this, this, and that. Give up smoking, cycle to work. I know you do that, Simon, so that's good.
Yeah, I did for the first couple of months.
Whatever else might be, eat more healthily, etc., etc. So we have good intentions, we have the motivation. But there's a lot of research out there, and that's what students on our course learn.
Okay.
The motivations aren't enough. You need to also sometimes plan an intervention to get the behavior change and maintain that behavior change. You have to also work on the environment, the context that we mentioned earlier. So I might have like big intention, I want to cycle to work, but I happen to live in London and there's no cycle path, and do I really want to do it? Because I might be fitter, but also might have an accident. So there needs to be the opportunity for the behavior to happen. And you also need to enable the person to do that and maintain that behavior. So again, with cycling, if you've never cycled before, you first have to learn how to ride a bike. And as an adult, it's actually difficult to learn that. So you need to enable the child, the person, whoever it might be, who wants to adopt this new behavior. You need to first get the skills and the capability for that behavior instilled in that person. And I think this actually can be hopefully used, well, this whole principle of behavior change is being used for all sorts of behaviors. So it could involve children as well, getting children, for example, go to schools. Absenteeism has been, some people have started looking at behavior change and absence from school. Getting into healthy sleeping patterns, getting the children to bed early. It's been shown that and you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. We know that has an effect on children's academic achievement, not only, also the emotional happiness, etc. of the parents. So if we can get parents or any practitioner working with children understand more about behavior change, how we can promote it, how we can evaluate our interventions, I think the more people know about this, the better. So.
Superb. Yeah, thanks for outlining that. So where can people go if they want to find out more about that? Well,
we have a website for that, so maybe we can add the link later or to the page, or they can just email me at s.lipka@derby.ac.uk. So I'm happy to direct them to our program pages and answer any questions.
Great.
All right.
Right, we'll end on that point. Thank you very much for joining us this week.
It's a pleasure.
It's been great. Thank you.
Fascinating topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll leave it there. And good luck on the rest of the units, and we'll catch up next week. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.